Good morning, Rechavia Nachlaot. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Wednesday morning, 9:30 to 10, Jerusalem time. Continuing to learn Perek Mem Aleph, chapter 41 in the Tanya. Over the past couple of days, we've been learning about the subject of fear of Hashem versus love of Hashem. And we're focusing on the subject of avodah. Avodah shlema. Complete and sincere service of Hashem. Avodah. Yesterday we started to expand on the subject of avodah. An eved, which is like a servant, a slave, if you will. And this is the idea of being oved Hashem, service of Hashem. Today, I would like to expand more on this subject of an eved. The best way to explain the difference between a servant and an eved, and someone that serves Hashem out of fear and someone that serves Hashem out of love, is to explain the general difference between an eved and a ben, a servant and a child. When it comes to Am Yisrael, Neshamot Yisrael, we are sometimes referred to as servants of Hashem, and sometimes we are referred to as banim, as children of Hashem. As we say on Rosh Hashanah davening, right after the blowing of the shofar, when we blow the shofar during the Musaf, Im kebanim, Im ke'avadim. Hashem, if you look at us, you view us as being children, or whether you view us as being your servants, you should still welcome us, you should still embrace us, and you should allow us to crown you as our king. So let's try to understand a little bit more in depth the difference between the way Am Yisrael is called an Eved Hashem, and how we are called Banim. As the Torah says in Parashat Re'eh, Banim atem lashem elokechem. You, Am Yisrael, our children, our sons, our children, Banim lashem elokechem, to Hashem your God. Now, when it comes to the concept of being a servant of Hashem, there are generally speaking two types of servants. Firstly, let me mention, when we talk about servants versus a child, we see that Yaakov Avinu has two names, Yaakov and Yisrael. Yaakov is generally called Eved, and Yisrael is called a son. Hopefully at the end of this lesson we're going to wrap it around and show you how it fits in beautifully to these two names of Yaakov Avinu. Because it's not just by Yaakov Avinu. By each and every single one of us, we're also Bnei Yisrael, Bnei Yaakov, children of Yaakov Avinu. So also by Am Yisrael, we also have these two concepts of Yaakov and Yisrael, Eved and Ben, a servant and a son, a child. So we started saying earlier that within the concept of servants, we have two different types, generally speaking. We have one type of servant which is considered to be a simple servant. That's called an Eved Pashut, a simple servant. And then we have an Eved Ne'eman. Eved Ne'eman is a trustworthy servant. What does it mean to be a trustworthy servant? So let's start with that because it's a little bit easier to explain. And then we'll understand, hopefully, the Eved Pashut, the simple servant. An Eved Ne'eman is someone who serves the master because he feels a connection to the master, because he appreciates the advice and the greatness of the master. For example, there are a number of examples, but we're going to try to focus on the actual subject. We have, for example, Avraham Avinu and his servant Eliezer. Eliezer was a servant, true. Eliezer, Eved Avraham. and when he introduces himself to Betuel and Lavan, about to ask the Rivka should be able to come and marry Yitzchak, he says, Vayomar, Eved Avraham Anochi, which is a very powerful statement. I am the servant of Avraham Avinu. That's my CV. That I am Avraham Avinu's servant. Wow. Do you know what it means to be Avraham Avinu's servant? But this is a servant which is an Eved Naaman, a trustworthy servant. Eliezer appreciated Avram for all of the greatness and all of his spirituality that Avram Avinu had. And he viewed it as being a zechut, a merit to be able to be Avram Avinu's servant. Because he was such a great servant, Avram Avinu also taught him much of the Torah that he learned. Therefore, Avram entrusted Eliezer with a document, a shtar, a document, which this document had all of Avram was signed off all of his belongings to Yitzchak. In other words, to the woman that's going to marry Yitzchak, soon to be Rivka. Avram is showing that he signed off he wrote off all of his belongings for that couple. One day, Bezrat Hashem, will talk about how Avram was even able to do such a thing. But I'm trying to focus right now on the subject. That Eliezer was such a trusted servant that Avram gave him this document, this shtar, and said, here, show this to the family. Show this that they should feel comfortable that their daughter is going to be taken care of. That's called an Eved Naaman. Another example of Eved Naaman was Yosef. Yosef, after he was thrown into the pit, then sold eventually to Mitzrayim, to Potiphar, and Potiphar entrusted Yosef, V'chol asher yeshlon natan biyado. Everything that Potiphar had, as being one of the great ministers in Mitzrayim in Egypt, Potiphar entrusted Yosef with everything he had in his home. That means that Yosef was not only a simple servant. Yosef was considered an Eved Naaman. Yosef was considered a trustworthy servant, someone who was appointed not just because he had two hands and was able to do work, but because he had a special Ruach Elokim. He had a special spirit of Hashem. And therefore Potiphar recognized this within Yosef, and therefore he entrusted him with everything. And therefore Potiphar saw a great blessing, a great bracha within all of his work, ever since Yosef got involved with running Potiphar's home. And so this is another example of an Eved Naaman. An Eved Naaman can be also someone like an accountant. An accountant works for someone, let's say full-time for a big business person or a big company, and often this person that works for the employer is because they appreciate and they value the greatness, whether it's the mind or the money or the potential or the characteristic of the employer, and therefore the worker of any kind would want to connect to this employer and to this individual. And therefore, what does the Eved do? What does this servant do? Because he serves, he's so dedicated to the master, he's so dedicated to the employer. What does this servant do? He totally gives himself over to the master. He totally devotes all of his being for the master, because he has an interest in the employer to be successful. That is such a special, an honorable type of worker. This is a worker halavai. Most employees would be this kind of worker or servant, however you want to word it. Obviously, in each scenario, you would have a different adjective. But the concept is someone who is dedicated, head and body, into the mission of the business or the individual who employs that person. That is a compliment both to the master, both to the employer, and to the worker or servant, as you want to call it, servant in quotes. Eved Ne'eman. There are other examples, but I'm trying to get to the point. Now, let's talk about the Eved Pashut. The Eved Pashut, the simple servant, maybe barely knows how to read, maybe doesn't recognize the greatness of the master. In fact, the main jobs that the Eved Pashut is going to do is going to be jobs of, technical things in the home, in the business, not to undermine any type of work, but some works are simply more simple, and everyone has their position. But there are some that are like cleaning the floors or doing things like that, which is every business needs it. Every shul, every company, every organization needs it. But they're a little more simple. You don't have to have an Einstein to do that work. And so the Eved Pashut probably doesn't recognize the greatness of the master. In fact, if he would, he probably wouldn't be doing this job. And so the Eved Pashut has something. It's not that he's a lower level of Eved. He just has another type of Eved. In fact, there's an advantage to the Eved Pashut even over the Eved Ne'eman. The simple servant has an advantage over the trusted servant, so to speak, the one that has a higher level of intellect and bonding connection with the master. The Eved Pashut, let's start with the Eved Ne'eman. The Eved Ne'eman, the trusted servant, if he wakes up and he has a bad day and he's in a bad mood, and maybe he doesn't really, he's not interested necessarily in that day in the master, his work is not going to be that great. Because his whole work is based on his own value and his own admiration of the master. However, the Eved Pashut, the simple servant, quote unquote, he's going to be dedicated with his full being any day in any situation. Because his relationship with his master is not dependent on something specific. His whole entire soul is dedicated 100% and given over to the master. So it doesn't make a difference if he understands what the master wants. He doesn't understand. He doesn't ask for explanations. Even if he's in a bad mood, he's still going to be dedicated. That's all. That's an advantage with the Eved Pashut, with the simple servant, even over the Eved Ne'eman, even over the trusted, intellectual, if you will, servant. So this is the concept of Eved. Whether you look at an Eved as far as Eved Pashut, or you look at Eved as Eved Ne'eman, they both have a common denominator, that they're both considered an Eved. And therefore, when the Alter Rebbe says in chapter Mem Aleph that we need to have avodah shlema, a complete, sincere service, each and every one of us are different types of people. And even within each and every one of us, you have some days that you feel a little more connected to Hashem as being an Eved Ne'eman, maybe after learning Torah, and you learn some Chassidus, you learn some Tanya, and you feel, wow, Hashem is amazing. I have the zechut of connecting to the Chochmah of Ein Sof of Hashem, the infinite wisdom of Hashem. Maybe then you're a little bit more like an Eved Ne'eman. And sometimes you're like an Eved Pashut, like a simple servant. Or another example, remember yesterday we talked about davening? That from the beginning of Birkot HaShachar until we reach the peak of Shmona Esrei the Amidah, and then the subsequent parts of davening towards the end, then we're sort of landing, so that we can bring the greatness of tefillah throughout the entire day. We can also use this as an analogy. When we start davening and we talk about the angels and the worlds that Hashem has created and all of the creations, and then we say the Shema, all of that is understanding, the Eved Ne'eman, connecting to Hashem and trying to elevate, especially if we've learned Chassidus beforehand. Wow, Hashem is so great, Hashem is amazing. Then finally we come to the Shemona Esrei. You probably think that the Shemona Esrei is the peak where you really want to connect to Hashem on a very intellectual level. The answer is no. When we come to the Shmona Esrei, then we're like the Evet Pashut. Yes, believe it or not. Like this simple servant. Like we said yesterday, even sometimes not to move, just to stand there, ka'avda kamamare, like a servant standing in front of his his master. In other words, this concept of being a simple servant has an advantage over Eved Ne'eman. And that's the goal. That's the ultimate level of avdut. That's the ultimate level of being a servant and being dedicated, batel, totally selfless towards one master. Unlike most would say that the greater level of Eved is the Eved Ne'eman. No, Eved Pashut is the more literal interpretation of the word servant. Eved Ne'eman is also a type of servant, but Eved Pashut is not the real, but the main level, the core of what an Eved really means. And when we talk about serving Hashem, the first connotation of Eved should be as far as the Eved Pashut, as far as the simple Eved. Then if we're to talk for a moment about Ben, a child of a parent, all of Am Yisrael, as we said earlier, were called Banim. Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem. You, Am Yisrael, are children of Hashem your God. Aha! We talk about a son, that's a whole different relationship. The closest comparison is to an Eved Ne'eman, a trustworthy servant. Now, it is not the same. It is different, but it's the analogy is perhaps closest to the concept of an Eved Ne'eman. By a child, the special bond between a child and a parent is a very close one. Is a very deep connection. The classical example that's brought in Chassidus is that if you're able to bring a child that was unfortunately separated from the parent for years, from the moment of birth, for example, it's only an example, of course, and by the age of 10 or 20 or any age, you bring the child to the parent, and you introduce the child to the parent, assuming that the child trusts you, and you say, this is your parent. In a moment, in a split moment, there is a very deep relationship, bond, which is formed between the child and the parent. But what do you mean? They didn't even spend any time together. Why should there be this connection? They didn't give him anything, any ice cream, nothing, and he didn't teach him anything, any Torah, anything. The answer is because the quintessential bond that there is between a child and a parent is something so deep that the moment that is revealed to the child and the parent, that they are parent and child, in a split moment, the form bonds. Therefore, even if the child. So, as far as the fact that the Eved Ne'eman, the trusted servant, has an admiration and a warm connection with the master, as opposed to the simple servant, in this point, that's where the child and a parent is closer, because you have more this affection. On the other hand, the Eved, the servant, can in a moment be dismissed, but the child, the bond is there forever. And even if when the child does good things, he doesn't do it because he understands it. He does it because of the connection. Obviously, it's a close bond. By a child, on the other hand, even if the parent did something, or the connection between the parent and the child has a little bit of friction, nevertheless, the child is going to hopefully do whatever it needs to do for the parent. The parent will do it for the child because it's my child. That's what the parent will say. And if it's not like that, then there's something wrong, because the Hashem implanted in the world that a parent is naturally connected to the child, and therefore there should never ever be a scenario when a parent disconnects from a child. A child from a parent can be not because of the child and parent, but because of external things that can come in. But that is sort of understandable, and that can be understood. Unfortunately, it's not It shouldn't be like that, but it's unfortunate. But a parent to a child, a parent should always maintain their strong, deep connection to the child, even in a revealed way, always to keep an open door. Never ever to ignore a child, always to welcome, because that's just how Hashem implanted in the world. That parents and children are one, and therefore nothing can separate between us. If there's anything which this terrible virus, which has spread around the world, has taught the world, is that a person can always rely on family. Our close-knit family, the people who we love most, the people who we're most connected to, our immediate family, siblings, parents, children, this is our home. Don't leave home. Stay at home, because this is the best protection for a person. And so let's get back to the subject. We talked about, generally speaking, the difference between the two types of servants, and we also talked about a son. Now, Am Yisrael, we are sometimes referred to Hashem as Evet Hashem, or Oved Elokim, a servant of Hashem, or we can be referred to as Banim Atem L'Hashem Elokechem. Now we're in this chapter of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe is putting more of a focus on the Eved, on the concept of Eved. And not just the Eved Ne'eman, but mainly on the Eved Pashut, on the simple servant. The simple, as the phrase goes in Hebrew, Lo Pashut, Liot Pashut. It's not simple to be simple. The Baal Shem Tov loved the simple folk, loved the simple people, their sincere trust in Hashem. He used to walk around from town to town and just ask people, how are you doing? And people would say, Baruch Hashem. He said, Hashem has so much pleasure when a simple person says Baruch Hashem, praises Hashem, and when a simple person says the words of Tehillim with all of his heart and soul. We have no idea how much Hashem appreciates this Tehillim. And so this concept of Eved Hashem is something which is avodah shlema, the sincere avodah, which has to be on the top of our agenda. And so when we talk about now, let's get back to Yaakov and Yisrael. In the beginning of the lesson, we talked about that there are two names to Yaakov Avinu, Yaakov, and then Hashem called him Yisrael. Yaakov is connected to the subject of Eved. It's a lower level. Eved, Yisrael is like a ben. I'm trying to emphasize the concept of Eved, therefore this will hopefully emphasize when we see the contrast between Yaakov and Yisrael. So Yaakov is the concept of Eved. Yaakov represents Yaakov Avinu, how he toiled and he worked hard, and his father-in-law put him through the mill, and wherever Esav chased him, wanted to kill him, his own brother, he went through years, decades of hardship. This is alluded to in the name Yaakov. Yaakov, the word Yaakov can be divided into two words. There are four letters: Yud, Ayin, Kuf, Vet. Yaakov, so it could be Yud, the first letter, and then Ekev, the last three letters, Ayin, Kuf, Vet. What would that mean? Yud represents the neshama, the essence of our neshama, and Ekev means a heel. In other words, a heel is the lowest part of a person's body, and Yud Ekev, that the level of the neshama is in a galut, is in some type of exile, and therefore there are hardships. And there's not always Gili Elokut, there's not always revelation. But nevertheless, Yaakov Avinu succeeds to overcome all of his challenges. He doesn't view them as hardships, rather he views them as challenges. And he uses that Yud, that little letter, which represents the Koach, the Neshama, of the core of our soul, which is always bonded with Yechida, with Hashem, with the essence of Hashem. And Yaakov Avinu succeeds to overcome all challenges. That's Yaakov. Then we have Yisrael. Please pay attention to the fact that Yisrael also starts with the letter Yud. Yisrael represents, why was he called Yisrael? Because when he wrestled with the angel of Esav and he won, the angel called him Yisrael. Why? Ki sarita im Elokim v'manashim vatuchal. Sarita, you were like a sar, you're like a minister, you overcame an angel of God. And this is also alluded to in the name Yisrael. You can divide Yisrael into three parts, three words, so to speak. There are five letters: Yud, Sin, Resh, Aleph, Lamed. So you could say Yud, Sar, Kel. Yud, this little Yud, the koach of the neshama, the power that Hashem gave us. Sar is a minister of Hashem, Kel of Hashem. And so this represents a different type of avoda of Hashem, which every Jew has. We also have this kind. We have this is more, this applies more when we have revelation of godliness. And we're on top of the world, like the time of Shlomo HaMelech, when we had a Beit HaMikdash. That's Yud Sar Kel. We are on top of the world. That shows that the Jew has every Yid has the power in a revealed way to give bracha to their surroundings and to the entire world. That's like the ben. That's a relationship of a child with a parent. When we have this relationship with Hashem, then we are on the level of Yisrael. Yaakov is a lower level, a time of galut, exile, struggling. But at the end, we always overcome the struggles. We overcome the challenges. So we're trying to put a focus. Al tira Yaakov avdi. Don't be afraid. Yaakov avdi, my eved. Because Yaakov, Hashem considers us, Yaakov, to be avdi, to be my servant. Hashem views us being a servant, and that's considered a compliment. To be Hashem's servant is not a derogatory terminology. Rather, the greatest compliment possible, because we are totally, selflessly dedicated, connected to Hashem, and that is one of the greatest compliments around. And so, just to wrap up this subject, we talked. We're elaborating on in the Tanya, the third page of Perek Mem Aleph, and we talked about the subject of avoda. And tomorrow we're going to read what it says in the Tanya, which is going to relate to the fact that we are all, both avadim and also banim, both servants of Hashem and also children of Hashem. And hopefully we gave a really beautiful insight into the subject of Eved. There are different types of Eved, but the greatest level, the most sincere level of Eved, of service of Hashem, is the Eved HaPashut, the simple servant. And the simple servant, although it might not look like on such a high level, because perhaps it doesn't have any understanding in the greatness of the king, nevertheless, we admire this level of service of Hashem. Each and every one of us sometimes can be like an Eved Pashut, and sometimes like an Eved Ne'eman. Each one of those levels are considered something very, very special and praiseworthy. Thank you so much for joining us. Bezrat Hashem tomorrow morning right here.